Okay, today I'm going to show you how to roast your own coffee. It's a cheap, fun, rewarding hobby. And you're only going to need a few very expensive things, and as with any hobby, you can go as far as you want to go with it and spend as much as you want, but I think the point of diminishing returns is met or reached very quickly. And so the way that I've been doing it for years now is a mixing bowl. And so you want one that's got a little bit of some high sides. Some people use a dog bowl. I used a mixing bowl. I put a couple of screws at the bottom onto this piece of wood so that I can take these little guys right here and just clamp it onto my stool. You're going to want a glove, a welding glove or a cooking glove or anything like that will work perfectly. Wooden spoon. You'll want a longer handle than I have. I've learned this. I've been wanting to get one with a longer handle and just haven't, and so I'm always, at the end of my roast, I'm always a little uncomfortable in my hand. But yeah, probably a longer handle than this, but any wooden spoon will do. You're going to want a heat gun, and so these can be had on the cheap on Amazon or your local Home Depot or whatever. And finally, strainer. So that's to help your beans cool when you're done. And you can get green beans on eBay or at a local place, or you can get them at Sweet Maria's, or I think there are plenty of other places you can get them. And so you don't want to overfill your bowl because the beans expand. So about a third full is as far as you want to go. I should say don't roast too few at a time, because if you're roasting batches too small, it's easy to heat them unevenly. And having more beans actually helps them heat more evenly. And so if you only have a few beans in there, it can get a little bit uneven. Alright, so what we'll do is we'll turn our heat gun on high. We're going to hold it like this, and we're going to be stirring like this. And basically the faster you can stir, the better your roast is going to, more even your roast is going to turn out. Don't hold your gun too close. If you hold too close, there'll be a few beans that get black. You don't want that. If you hold your gun too far away, your beans will just never roast. And so there's a happy medium. And I'm going to be talking during the video, but this is going to be noisy, so I'm just saying this ahead of time. You'll start out kind of close. You want to get the beans hot first off. But then once you get into, so the bean will crack twice, depending on how far you roast it, but you want, after your first crack, to sort of back your heat off a little bit, because the bean, instead of sort of soaking up heat, almost begins to emit heat. They say that it becomes exothermic. I'm not sure exactly if it becomes exothermic, but it definitely takes a lot less heat after the first crack. And you'll know that you're overheating your bean if it begins to smoke excessively, or if the bean begins to look oily. You don't want your bean to look oily. You want it to stay satiny. And so if you mess it up, don't worry. You're still going to have a coffee that tastes good, and you have plenty of tries. If you get a whole bag of coffee to practice on, you'll have plenty of tries. But anyway, let's get started. So this bean we're roasting right here, this is a new bean that I've just ordered. It's a Brazilian bean. It's a decaffeinated bean. It's a water processed decaffeinated Brazilian bean I got on eBay. Never tried it before. Some beans have a very pronounced crack that you'll hear, and some of them hardly crack at all. Some of them get dark very quickly. Some of them don't get dark very quickly at all, and so I really have no idea right now what kind of bean I've got here, and so we're just gonna have to wait and see. The bean will go through some phases. It starts out kind of a dark to a pale greenish brown, and actually as you roast it, it will begin to actually turn a lighter golden color before it begins to darken up. The beans that I had previous to this were a Mexican decaffeinated bean, and they were a wonderful roasting and tasting bean, except they didn't crack at all. It was the first bean I'd ever encountered that crack was so faint, so little there that you really had to roast it completely by color, which wasn't very easy either because those beans got dark very quickly, and so it's very difficult to tell the difference between a medium roast and a dark roast of that bean, so you really had to get a feel for it. Luckily I had 10 pounds of it, and so by the time I had finished all my 10 pounds, I was getting pretty good at understanding the bean. The cool thing about roasting this way, if you're roasting for yourself, is that freshly roasted beans, coffee beans, are really only good to drink from about 3 days after you roast them till about, I would say, a week and a half after you roast them. That's the sweet spot. If you don't drink the coffee in that period of time, you're really missing out on 90% of what a fresh roasted coffee has to offer as far as it being different from a store-bought coffee or a Starbucks or something like that. And so roasting in small batches like this, you basically can just roast maybe once a week and always have coffee that's in that perfect sweet time period, where it's just been roasted about a week ago. Now you notice I said that it's really best between 3 days and a week and a half, and the reason for that is that those first 3 days or so, depending on the bean, it really isn't going to taste good, and that's because the bean is doing something called outgassing. I don't exactly know what that is, except to say that it is emitting a gas of some sort from the roasting process, and you can smell it on the bean, and you can taste it in the coffee, and it's not pleasant. And if you're roasting for the first time, I recommend that you drink a cup of coffee, brew a cup of coffee right after you roast the bean, and taste it so you'll know. And you'll taste it once, and you'll know it from then on. And so if you ever drink a cup of coffee that's got that taste, you can say, man, somebody didn't wait long enough after the roast of this bean, because this is a gassy bean. And so I would say definitely do that, but then understand, that's why you don't want to do that. So I'm looking at this bean now. You can see the bean has been starting to transition into that golden, brownish golden state that I was talking about earlier. I hope you're able to see this on my camera. My camera is kind of crappy, but it's sort of lightened up a little bit. This is a kind of a small bean compared to the Mexican bean. These are kind of little, and so I don't know if it's going to make a difference on roasting time. The average roasting time is about 8, 9, 10 minutes. If you see that you're going significantly longer than that, you're not using enough heat. If your roast goes much quicker than that, you're going to know it, because your bean is going to be smoking, it's going to get black, it's going to be uneven, and it's going to be greasy. And so it's a little bit different for every bean, but somewhere in the 8 to 10 minute time period is the correct time for a good roast. And so most of the time you're spending is going to be at the beginning here, before either of your cracks. And so this wouldn't even be considered a light roast at this point. This is not even roasted. This would be still considered green, and you would never drink it this light. Generally speaking, the first time I roast a bean, I will bring it to the beginning of second crack, and that's sort of like a medium dark roast, and that's where we're going to stop with this bean. But after you've roasted a bean, you can then determine whether you'd like it lighter or darker, and so the next time you roast it, you can tweak it. And the good and the bad part about having 5 or 10 pounds of a certain bean is basically by the time you've used it all up, that's when you've really figured out that bean, and then you have to start all over again. But that's part of the fun. So some people who roast at home use something called a drum roaster. And I'm going to tell you why I don't think that is nearly as much fun. So, with the pros of a drum roaster is you can roast a lot more at one time, and you can get a much more consistent and even roast from roast to roast. Because you're going to have a consistent heat, you're going to have a consistent turn the thing is turning at. You can use to measure the amount. Anyway, it's much more consistent. However, you don't get to see the bean. You don't get to smell the bean. Well, I mean, you kind of do, but I mean, you don't get to look at it. You don't get to really be intimate with it. And so with this method, what happens is you get to really watch the bean go through all of its transition phases. You get to watch how it's smoking, whether it's not smoking. You get to hear all the cracks really well, and you get to adjust your heat throughout the roast. And so in a drum roaster, you're looking at a single heat the entire time. But with this, I'll tell you, after that first crack, you really want less heat on the bean. And that's with just about every bean I've ever done. So that was, you heard that pop, that was the very beginning of the first crack. We're going to see if this bean cracks a lot or not. Yeah, I prefer this to drum roasting because I don't drink a ton of coffee, and I like to have fresh coffee. And so this is also, I don't have to have a big drum. I don't have to buy a drum. So now you can see the bean has gone from that golden state to looking more like what you would expect coffee to look like. It's beginning to smoke a little bit. That's fine. You've heard a couple of cracks there. That indicates that the bean was nearing its first crack. You'll have some outliers. There was another, that's the first crack. So the cracks sound different. The first crack will sound more like popcorn, whereas the second crack will sound more like snapping toothpicks. And once you get to know a bean, you'll be able to tell easily which one is which. Obviously, first crack comes first, but you can have some late cracking first cracks that actually will be cracking at the same time as some of the seconds and things like that. And so sometimes they'll blend together. I've seen some beans that have their cracks that are very well spaced. I've seen other beans that their cracks run one right into the other. And so every bean is different. But you can hear, so these little popping sounds, this is the beginning of first crack here. Now I can already tell you this bean looks a little bit dark for this phase. Usually I'm used to beans looking a little bit lighter than this during first crack. And so this is just going to be, this bean particularly just does this. So it seems like this bean is not a very cracking bean, I guess. Doesn't have a lot of crack to it, because I can see that we're sort of going through the portion where we would normally have a lot of cracking going on for first crack, and so I'm going to just say this bean doesn't have a very pronounced first crack. I'm going to start backing my heat off a little bit here. The way that I do that is I just lift the gun up a little bit farther from the bean. This is the part of the roast where I always wish I had a slightly longer spoon. I always think about it while I'm roasting, but always forget about it when I'm done, and so I always have this short spoon as a result of that brain process. So you can see the bean is starting to smoke a little bit more. The bean is starting to get a little bit dark. Now we're waiting for the beginning of that second crack. And when we get to the beginning of that second crack, I'm basically going to stop at that point, and I'm going to take the beans, I'm going to put them into the strainer, and we're going to try and cool them off as quickly as we can. So you hear we're at the beginning of second crack here. I heard a couple of outliers for second crack. Okay, you hear it. That's it, that's second. See this, it's not as loud, it sounds like snapping toothpicks. So it has a pretty pronounced second crack, and it didn't have a very good first crack, but that's fine, now we know. Alright. You can actually hear it a little bit better now. You can hear it still, the second crack is still going. And so now we're trying to arrest the roast. And so the way you arrest the roast is you try and cool it down as fast as you can. And so you just try and get a lot of air through it. Some people have arresters where they'll actually have a fan with like a tube that you can set the beans on that will continuously pull air through the beans. And that's a good way to do it. You don't have to do it that way if it's a small amount like this. You can just sort of like, blow on it and sort of wing it around like this, shake it, get it going. You'll notice that I didn't overheat the bean though. Even though it's smoking pretty good, the bean is not oily. It's very satiny. The roast is nice and even. All the beans look more or less the same. And so that is what you want. You just do this for a while until the bean cools down, and then just store it. Store it in an unsealed container, not a non-airtight container, because it has to outgas, for 2 or 3 days. And then brew a cup of coffee, see how you did. Alright, hope that was helpful.